The topic of today's lesson is going to be about the scientific method, or the process of doing science. So you'll notice, if you are following along with your notes, that they look like this. This is going to be pretty straightforward. There's headings that correspond to the different slides, and there's a space for you to write, or if you're using the fillable form, you can type whatever information you need under each heading. I did also provide for you this diagram. We'll talk about this diagram for a bit, and so you also might want to make notes on the diagram itself as we discuss that. So if you do not have this note sheet available, go ahead and pause the video right now and locate the note sheet, and then come back and keep watching. So what is science? When I say science, I mean a process. We're talking about a way of knowing and learning about the natural world. Science is always going to be evidence-based. Evidence is something that's observable or measurable. You can use your senses to notice something about science. That means that it is very concrete evidence. And also, science is dynamic. Dynamic means it can change, as opposed to being static or staying the same. And a really good example of this would be just 100 years ago, scientists did not even know that DNA was the molecule responsible for making us who we are and carrying that genetic information. So here's this diagram that I included on the note sheet. I really like this diagram because it depicts the scientific method as a process that is always continuing and then looping around. We have this little loop here. I'll talk about that in a minute. So science isn't a step-by-step process that you start in one place and then you get to the end and you finish and it's done and you never do it again. It's really going to be more circular. Typically, we consider the observations, making observations, to be the first step of the scientific method. And again, an observation is something that you can observe with your senses. You can see it, you can hear it, you can feel it, you can measure it. An observation is likely going to lead to an interesting question. Why is this thing happening that I'm observing? Your question can lead to a hypothesis. A hypothesis is going to be what you think is happening. What's the general cause for this thing that you're interested in? And notice that the next step is a testable prediction. A hypothesis and a prediction are very closely related to each other. They're technically not the same thing. A hypothesis is a more broad statement about what you think, whereas a testable prediction is very specific. If I do this, then this other thing is going to happen. For the purpose of this class, I kind of lump a hypothesis and a prediction together, and if you write your hypothesis in the form of a prediction, that is going to accomplish the goal that we need for this course. Next, we have gathering data. This is going to be in the process of doing an experiment, and that experiment should be designed to test the specific prediction or hypothesis that you made. Now, after you gather data, notice that the arrows go in two different directions. This arrow here is going to, by far, be the most common next step. After gathering data in an experiment, scientists have to refine those data. They have to think about maybe altering their experiment to test it in a slightly different way. You might need to expand or reject or somehow refine your hypothesis, and that's going to lead to a new prediction. So most of science is done here. You do an experiment, you figure out you need to change some aspect of it, you develop a new prediction, a new experiment, do it all again. Rinse and repeat over and over again. Most scientists spend just about their entire careers in this loop here, always learning, always refining, always testing the next thing. Once there's a large body of evidence to support a general idea, and also evidence from multiple people, all of that evidence can be grouped together to develop a theory. We will talk about the difference between a theory and a law here in just a minute. But in general, a theory is going to be based on the data gathered by many, many scientists doing many, many experiments. So here's a comparison of scientific theory versus a scientific law. These have very specific meanings in the world of science. A scientific theory is more of an explanation. It's going to explain how or why a thing happens, and it is accepted by scientists as being the best explanation to explain a large body of data. And so scientists are really going to look at a theory as something that's very well established versus in day-to-day conversation, you may think of a theory as just being a guess. Well, in science, just to keep in mind that when science say something is a scientific theory, it is well supported, it is broadly applicable, and it is seeking to explain the how or the why of a phenomenon. A scientific law is a little bit different. A scientific law is something that is directly observable. We call that empirical. And it is simply going to state what happens. It is the statement of an observation that is held to be universally true. So a lot of times we can actually describe laws mathematically because it's just a relationship between two things. A good example of a law might be the law of gravity. We can observe what happens between two objects when they come into close proximity to each other. We can actually describe that mathematically. So that makes the law of gravity a law rather than a theory. We're not using it to explain how or why the objects interact, just the way that they do that is directly observable and quantifiable mathematically. So a scientist is going to do a lot of experiments. When you start an experiment, you're going to start with an observation. We talked about an observation being something that you can detect with your senses, meaning you can see, smell, hear, feel, or taste it. Although, don't taste things in a science lab. You've probably learned that before. That's definitely against the lab safety rules. You can also use your observation to develop a logical inference. An inference is what you think is happening. It is not directly observed, but it is a logical next step or a logical conclusion based on something you do observe. Think about this as an example. You walk into your house and you smell something burning. Perhaps an inference that you could get from that observation would be that your brother was making toast and left the bread in too long and has burned his toast. Now, if you did not see that happen, that's not an observation, but that would be a logical inference based on your observation from your sense of smell when you walked in the house. The next step is to write a hypothesis, which in our case is simply going to be our prediction. We're combining hypothesis and prediction together here. It must be testable, and it must be based on something that you already know. That's the educated part, if you've ever heard it called an educated guess. I recommend using an if, then, because format when you're writing a hypothesis because it really makes you think through why you're saying what you're saying. So if we're doing an experiment about plants and fertilizer, a hypothesis for that experiment could be, if I give a plant fertilizer, then it will grow taller than other plants because it has more nutrients to use for growing. So we've predicted the effect of one thing on another, and we have included some background information about why we think that to be true. When you design an experiment, you are going to have to deal with things like variables. First of all, a variable is something that changes. There are two major types of variables you have to be aware of. The first one is called the independent variable or the manipulated variable. And the second one is called the dependent variable, or sometimes you may hear that called the responding variable. The independent variable is the thing that you as the experimenter have decided to change from one treatment to the next. So if you want to think of it as the I in independent, I, the researcher, am changing it. That's a good way to remember. The dependent variable is what changes in response to the thing you decided to change. This is probably going to be, what are the results of your experiment? What data are you collecting? That is probably your dependent variable. So in an experiment, you have your variables that are changing, but everything else you want it to stay the same. We call those the constants. And then finally, most lab experiments are going to have what we call a control group. A control group is going to be a treatment that is not getting your experimental treatment. Whatever your independent variable is, you're going to leave one group alone so they're not exposed to that independent variable so that you can have a baseline for comparison. The experimental groups would then be all of the parts of your experiment that do get exposed to your independent variable. So if we have an experiment, again, let's go back to the plant fertilizer experiment. If we're trying to see how the quantity of fertilizer impacts plant growth, well, the thing that we have changed is the amount of fertilizer. That's our independent variable. We are measuring the plant growth, so probably the height of the plant in response. So the height of the plant would be the dependent variable because the height of the plant is going to depend on the quantity of fertilizer that we used. We're going to keep things constant, like a constant amount of light, the constant amount of soil, constant amount of water. All of those are going to stay the same throughout all of our treatments. And then our control group is probably going to be a group of plants that we don't give any fertilizer to because we want to see how much the plant grows on its own. Maybe it would normally have grown to this height and the fertilizer is not really having any effect. When you collect data in your experiment, it's important to make sure that you are collecting appropriate data. That could be qualitative or more looking at the quality of your results. That is still observable, but it's probably not something that you can put a number on. Maybe something like a color change, whereas a quantitative data would be something that is countable or otherwise measurable. If you can hold a ruler up to it and put a number on it, that would be quantitative data. Your data, when you graph it, always make sure that you have the data on the correct axes. Your independent variable, whatever that is going to go on the X or the horizontal axis, and the dependent variable goes on the Y axis, which is your vertical axis. You will also need to make sure you are using the proper type of graph for your data. If you have categories, you're going to want to use a bar graph. If you have a series that is continuous, maybe you are heating up a container of water and you're taking measurements every 5 degrees. That would be a continuous series. You would connect those dots with a line graph. And then a pie chart if you are looking at parts of a whole. Your data, when you collect it, you need to make sure you are always using the metric system. We always use the metric system in science. That would be meters, liters, and degrees Celsius if you're talking about temperature. So make sure your lab measurements are always in metric units and you include the unit next to the number. Don't just write down a number like 5.2. If we're talking about the height of a plant, it would be 5.2 centimeters. So don't forget to write that in there. When scientists use the metric unit, they use units that are established in what we call the International System of Units, or SI, which is short for Système International, which is the French version of the International System of Units. It is based on the metric system, and these are some of the SI units that scientists use. Don't worry about memorizing this. This is just for your benefit so you can see what those SI units are. And finally, publication is the final step. Scientists have to verify each other's work, so they undergo a process of peer review where they read the work of their colleagues and they give feedback on it before that gets published. And when the publication happens, it happens in journals like the Journal of Cellular Biology, Science, Nature. Those are all scientific journals that scientists publish in. So hopefully you found this to be helpful, and if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.